Kafe, in Taberna.
It is Wednesday, dear friends and detractors. Come and sit with us and have a refreshing water and a strong cup of coffee, or whatever you may be drinking. With me today is my usual co-host, Classical Theist.
Hello, how's it going?
I'm going.
Yeah.
It's one of those days, but we're going to be talking about a single topic today, and probably sundry things. This is going to be a very casual cafe. But before we get to the topic, I'll announce that we should have another episode this week of Into Taberna proper, in addition to your Wednesday cafe. So you may go into Taberna in addition to the cafe this week. Subject that we said we would discuss last Wednesday, or whenever we recorded, but things happened. So
You were warned that the scheduling would be sporadic, so
yeah, there's no promises here because I can't promise anything. You never know when the Rockefellers will send the vampires, and you have to just pick up shop. But speaking of people who identify Rockefeller vampires, that's tangentially related. We're just going to talk about E. Michael Jones's take on Traditionis Custodes today.
yes.
On the motu proprio, heavily restricting the Latin Mass. That is literally the main thing we're going to talk about today, and I realize that we are walking into a landmine.
Yes, absolutely.
And there's a dog barking outside. But it must be done. It must be done for the sake of content and for the sake of our own intellectual honesty. It must be done. You were the one that told me to actually to watch this because I didn't know he had any presence on YouTube. I mean, first of all, it wasn't his video; it was Peter Helland.
Right. Yeah.
On his public access TV show in South Bend, Indiana.
Yeah. I'm that it never ceases to amuse me that he has the public access.
The last bastion of free speech in the United States.
But yeah, so I think we should just start off from the onset and say flat out that we do disagree with his take, generally speaking, and we acknowledge much of the criticism that he's getting for his take, which, for those of you who don't know, he even goes so far as to be critical of Summorum Pontificum itself.
Right.
So E. Michael Jones has always been very, very, very hesitant and reluctant to offer any kind of scathing criticism of the church hierarchy in general. Right. That's just always been a part of who he is. I mean, I think you could argue that his fundamental concern with Medjugorje was the fact that it didn't have episcopal approval, and he's always been first and foremost willing to defend the not only the legitimacy but the, I guess, fundamental good intentions of, at least generally speaking, the episcopate, even as it exists today.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's always sort of been his ecclesiological disposition. And so for that reason, he's always been very critical of the SSPX. He's had debates with Michael Davies
A debate that I
on.
think he lost, frankly.
He, he didn't do very well. Well, he's never been a very good debater. I mean, just generally. I think there are points that I would have made against Davies that would have been much more cogent than EMJ. Um, even though I like Michael Davies a lot in terms of just his general contribution to the conversation and his own personal sanctity. But that's neither here nor there. The point is, E. Michael Jones has always been very much resistant to Catholic traditionalist movements that define themselves sort of in opposition to the
The episcopacy.
the episcopacy and the hierarchical structure of the church. So he's always defended legitimacy of the Second Vatican Council. He's always defended the laicity of the Novus Ordo, and he's always been. He's never seen like the Latin Mass as a central means of combating modernity. He just hasn't. And I will say, just sort of as a brief aside, his take on the Second Vatican Council. I mean, I pretty much share it. I should pretty much share his take on the Second Vatican Council. I think that if someone like him, given what he's said on a certain tribe, if someone like him can accept Nostra Aetate, I think we can pretty much just accept that it's like it's deeply flawed in its phraseology and everything, but it doesn't necessarily contradict past teachings necessarily. If someone like him can accept what it says about Jewish people, I think that says something. But anyway, so that's sort of just give a background of where he's coming from.
Yeah, he has dialed back the bishop defense force thing a little bit. Yeah, he's dialed it back a bit since the Francis pontificate, and he wrote some very lovely articles, very well-researched articles that became the ebook called Pope Francis in Context about who Jorge Bergoglio was, and I thought it was a very good piece of journalism. I think the other thing I'm going to say is, like, some people will say that E. Michael Jones is a crank. I think that's too harsh, as we talked about before the show, because I had, like, a mild... I had a moment where I'm like, am I stupid? Like, and, you know, you told me, you're like, no, EMJ does have value, but EMJ is a very poor historian. He has very sloppy scholarship as a historian, and it has to be admitted. Logos. So, you know, I mean, a lot of people on the dissident right will be like, oh, you know, he's like the intellectual godfather of the trad right. That's like what Gavin McInnes said about him, right?
Which is not true.
No. It is for people who only imbibe YouTube content and then read like 20 pages of his books.
First of all, like, EMJ has not really been a figurehead of sorts of right-wing traditionalism, particularly for young people, for like that long at all. Only like a few years, honestly.
And it's probably coming to an end because of this.
Yeah.
Which we'll address more, but so, you know, first of, you know, so you know, we admit that his take on the liturgical reforms and on the traditionalist movement is not entirely cogent.
Well, let's get into that a little bit, because I don't think we fully fleshed out what his take is.
No, we haven't. I feel like we have to do a lot of couching first. So the one thing I'll say before we go on is that E. Michael Jones is a very poor historian. He is capable of doing academic research, so his stuff on Cardinal Kroll is very good. But he is much better in short form than long form, is my understanding. And this is actually a reason why I've actually avoided many of his books and have mostly read Just Culture Wars and his shorter ebooks. And his ebooks are basically series of articles that he brings together. And so, you know, I suppose what we would say before we go on into his actual meat and potatoes of his take on the motu proprio is that E. Michael Jones is a very good cultural critic. He has a lot of value there, and he is also a very quirky man that's kind of fun to observe and watch and listen to talk. But he is not Augusto del Noce, okay? And Michael Jones is not going to give you a thorough, ironclad, intellectual genealogy of the crisis. And it's actually bad that he tries to be that when he's honestly at his best when he writes things like Pope Francis in Context, or Ballet Parking, or Sex with Monsters, which is his book about Guillermo del Toro, about the his having sex with the Fishman movie, and his book The Whale Rider.
I mean, it should be acknowledged, like, his academic credentials come from literature.
Yeah. So, that all being said, E. Michael Jones basically is best as a cultural critic and journalist, not as an academic historian, which he is not.
Or as a theologian.
Yeah. As we've been told by people who have read Logos Rising, he kind of has somewhat of a facile take on Islam. But go ahead, CT. Let's lay out the video so that we can finally talk about it. We've done enough couching, but you know, people are going to frickin' burn this cafe down to the ground either way. So let's do it.
So his fundamental take on this seems to be that he starts off by giving sort of like a historical overview of the traditional Latin Mass and its presence in the wake of the Second Vatican Council and the reforms of Paul VI, right? So he starts off, walking us through its initial suppression, by Paul VI and John Paul II, and then its gradual allowances under John Paul II, and then the universal allowances under Summorum Pontificum, right? And his general criticism of Summorum Pontificum seems to be that in just allowing the traditional Latin Mass to be used without really any restrictions, and to be just sort of a rite alongside the Novus Ordo, what it kind of does is it fosters a sort of, in his opinion, liturgical consumerism, whereby traditionalist Catholics start to view a particular form of the Mass through the lens of their own, I guess, personal tastes.
I think that what he was saying really
that's one dimension of it,
right. What he's saying is that the introduction, the liberty of the liberation of the traditional Latin Mass exacerbated an already existing situation of Catholics not having a unity that they had in the past, which we'll talk about more later, because people are going to say, well...
That's very important.
Yeah, people are going to be like, but Knight Errant, CT, don't you guys always say that unity never existed, that there's always been crisis? And it's like, yes, but things are particularly bad now, where organs and mechanisms of culture, and, this is very much so... you can read Del Noce's The Age of Secularization and The Crisis of Modernity. just talking about how certain organs and institutions of culture and views and hermeneutics have been completely flattened, that things are particularly bad right now, and basically the only one that can save us will be God, and it's not going to be pleasant.
Right. And now what you just said about unity, I think is very important because, and this is part of where I disagree with EMJ theologically, because he takes this in a bit of a theological direction, which I think is a bit problematic. Because what he says is that when you have the um, the extraordinary form and the ordinary form alongside each other as well, you can have one or you can have the other. Necessarily, this sets up a zero-sum game whereby the ordinary form and the extraordinary form have to be related to each other as better or worse, and that if you he even goes on to say that if you have two rights, you have two sources of unity, and you can't have two sources of unity in the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church, the fundamental source of unity is the one faith, the one Lord, the one baptism under one Roman pontiff. Now, and he kind of uses this to give his own definition of schism. And I think this is very problematic because, first of all, the Latin Rite, there are different forms of the Latin Rite already. You have the Ambrosian Rite, you have the Dominican Rite, um, and you have, of course, the Rite of Pius V and the Rite of Paul VI, right? Um, and I'm pretty sure there are others, right? Within the
Yeah.
Latin Rite.
To talk like Father Hess for a moment, there is the Mozarabic Visigothic, yeah. There's a couple, and then there's the Sarum Rite, which I think still exists, which is the old pre-Tridentine English Mass, basically from England.
Right. I mean, and and you have the Ordinariate, brought in by Pope Benedict XVI, and even if you take his theological concept to its logical extreme, then shouldn't we also discount the Eastern rites?
Yeah.
So I just think that when he crosses over into sort of a theological definition of schism and ecclesiastical unity, he gets into some trouble, and I don't think he articulates it very well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of goes back to what we were saying about his limitations, and he seems to be just very fundamentally opposed to pitting one right against the other because um, he is very, very, very big on maintaining that uh, that not only ecclesiastical unity but also a Catholic cultural unity.
Right,
That
because
that, that yeah, that you have said just now is severely lacking, in which it is, and I think he sees liturgical factionalism as fundamentally preventing the reemergence of that unity. And that's not defending his view, but it is sort of give it, I think, a bit wider perspective. Um,
right, because he,
yeah.
what he talks about, he's obsessed with like what you could call the golden age of Catholicism in America, right?
Yes.
Which is basically, we could say, right from when Al Smith lost the presidential campaign of 19. I'm just going to go because there's dead air. Because I want to look this up. I'm sorry, listeners. So Al Smith's presidential campaign, 1928. So we can say, like, basically from the Great Depression until Vatican II, right? So we're talking Father Coughlin, the Family Rosary, Fulton Sheen, the Production Code, the Catholic Anti-Communist Crusade, all of this stuff, and where
Right.
he sees that, and he sees that had things gone apace, Catholicism would have become the majority religion in America,
Mm-hmm.
and would have essentially taken over all of the political institutions. Um, but then things fell apart, and so uh, everyone knows that things fell apart, but they have different reasons for saying that. And so he thinks that the traditionalists are focusing on too much of a monocausal narrative, which is that the liturgy changed and that's why.
Yeah.
But I think EMJ himself can be a little bit too monocausal.
Yeah.
When it
I mean,
comes,
he's going his own solution, quote unquote, is going to be very monocausal and tunnel vision.
yeah. So,
Uh,
but for EMJ, the reason why this is a problem is he looks to the golden age of American Catholicism as a healthy church, particularly in the United States, doing its job of
yes.
protecting the human race from the forces of darkness that are also based in Tel Aviv now. Okay.
Right. I mean, that's so foundational for him because he sees that as the mainstream of cosmic history in many ways.
Yeah.
This tension between
The synagogue
we
and the
could say the
church.
old covenant and the new Israel and in the church, the mystical body. And so what he sees as represented in this earlier stage of really American Catholicism, at least when we're talking about his primary object of historical interest relative to this conversation, um, he sees a church confident in itself, unified in its ability to act, unified in its intention to uh,
Evangelize the
defend its
world.
evangelize the world, defend itself, defend its rights, uh, and and uh, work toward the salvation of souls. So he sees that as a fundamental source of Catholic strength, flowing from really her very identity, right? The church's very identity, I think. And what he sees as and his criticism of the traditionalist movement, specifically the traditionalist liturgical movement, is a tendency to find cover underneath uh, what he would consider to be a liturgical preference. I mean, I think that you and I would see it as maybe a bit more than that, but that's sort of how he sees,
Right.
finding cover underneath a liturgical preference um, and thereby secluding oneself from being part of the real solution, which will be to rebuild this Catholic unity, and to rebuild this Catholic unity from within the church itself, not secluded in one in communities that are just defined by a liturgical expression of the mass.
Right. The
That
Bennett.
can kind of yeah, sort of like a liturgical Benedict option, if you will.
Right.
That can kind of hinder uh, a a uh, a productive conversation about what is actually preventing this the reemergence of, of this Catholic unity and Catholic strength and this Catholic social um, influence that we once had and now lost. If you focus so much on hiding behind the Latin Mass and criticizing Vatican II, you may lose sight of what precise historical developments and what cultural um, forces and what um, social structures are preventing that Catholic unity from taking shape again. And I think one way that he kind of illustrates that this is the case is that um, when Summorum Pontificum came out, he imagined someone like Thomas Woods cracking open a champagne bottle. Why? Well, Thomas Woods is really someone who doesn't think in conformity with the mind of the church on society, on economics. And that body of teaching, I think, was integral to how the church was able to be so influential as a uh, as a voice,
Yeah,
in that period.
as a cultural force in the world.
I mean, I think of Father Coughlin, right?
Mm-hmm.
This social teaching of the church, embodied by the encyclicals of the Leonine encyclicals, and even the encyclicals of Pius XI, that strengthened the church's ability to respond to cultural and social problems, right? And it even garnered uh, uh, a enthusiastic following, right? I mean, think of how many devoted fans Father Coughlin had, right?
Mm-hmm.
This was helped by Catholic social teaching, and whereas someone like Thomas Woods largely rejects uh, fundamental principles upon which that social teaching is based, right? um,
Mm-hmm.
and yet he can call himself a traditionalist because he likes the Latin Mass. He's critical of Pope Francis. He's critical of Vatican II in many ways, right? And think of how William F. Buckley loved the Latin Mass and was critical of Vatican II.
Yeah, and
And yet,
he hated the paleocons.
he said Mater si, Magistra no.
Uh-huh.
You know, so I think if there's insight to be had on EMJ's take, it's going to be about that. Now, I've talked a lot, so now you can get in and give some of your thoughts.
So, you know, the thing that a I was just looking at Jeffrey Tucker's physiognomy, and it's atrocious. I've got an ugly mug myself, but I've never seen someone who looked more like a '80s cartoon villain. But that aside, the response that the traditionalist Catholic would have is, you know, what I was saying was like, okay, but lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi. The law of the way you pray is the law of how you believe, is the law
Right.
of how you live. And so it's kind of odd to me how EMJ, Dr. Jones, has always, you know. So the impression I got in the video was it was almost like he was like, why can't the church just make its damn mind over what it's going to be? It's like, okay, if you want to do the Novus Ordo, just do the Novus Ordo. If you want to do the Tridentine Rite, just do the Tridentine Rite. And I think this is the problem that EMJ has as kind of a thinker, is that he's afflicted with a certain very analytical, what would be called autism in these circles.
Right.
And
Yes.
so, you know, what you were saying about his using Augustine's, you know, thoughts on schism, that it's merely lack of charity, that it's a lack of charity. That's what schism is theologically defined by, is that you separate yourself from the body of Christ because of your lack of charity. Okay, that's true, but that is not what it is canonically. And the church is a societas perfecta. You know, reading a little bit of Bellarmine there. And it has laws. And so to EMJ, specifically with the Society of St. Pius X, who have their own issues, obviously. I'm not like a complete cheerleader, but I do admire them in many ways. In EMJ's mind, there is no such... A schismatic mentality does not exist. It must either be schism or communion. There is no category in between. And so...
It kind of speaks to his general mode of thinking.
Yeah. And I think that's frankly problematic.
Yeah, well, and it misses a very important element also of how why the church was able to be such a attractive hub of of uh, of Christian institution through its liturgy in many ways,
Yeah, and
right? Through its self-confident liturgy, through its liturgical patrimony.
heretics like John Adams saw the power of the Catholic liturgy. Okay, like John Adams went to. I guess I don't know what.
Explain that a bit. I haven't. That's new to me. I think that would be very valuable to listeners to get into that a little.
Yeah, so I don't remember the full context right now, but what I do know, John Adams went to a Catholic mass. Perhaps he was visiting Charles Carroll, but he basically was both repulsed and attracted by it. And yeah, they attended during the First Continental Congress. And he said, and he constantly wrote letters to his wife, and this is what he said. He said, this afternoon, led by curiosity and good company, I strolled away to Mother Church, or rather Grandmother Church. I mean the Romish Chapel. Heard a good short moral essay upon the duty of parents to their children, founded in just and charity, to take care of those interests of temporal and spiritual. And so he goes on to saying, the poor wretches fingering their beads, chanting Latin, not a word of which they understood, their paternosters and Ave Marias, their holy water, they're crossing themselves perpetually.
Could smell the seed.
Yeah. They're bowing and kneeling, the dress of the priest with rich lace, the image of the crucifix about, wax, blah, 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 blah. But how shall I describe the picture of our Savior in a frame of marble above the altar? And so he says at the end, though, so he's decrying all this, but he says, the music, consisting of an organ and a choir of singers, went all the afternoon, excepting sermon time, and the assembly chanted most sweetly and exquisitely. Here is everything which can lay hold of the eye, ear, and imagination, everything which can charm and bewitch the simple and the ignorant. I wonder how Luther ever broke the spell.
That I've never heard that quote. That is amazing to me, and that really speaks to, I think, what EMJ is missing. That these forms of liturgy are not just means of abstract unity, and I don't know, he wouldn't say that. They really, part of why the church was able to maintain such cultural strength was because its main face to the world was its liturgy.
Well, just you can just even dabble, and I've only dabbled. I'm not like an expert by any means, but you can just dabble a little bit into, the Canadian semiotician, Marshall McLuhan. The medium is the message, right?
Yes.
And I think that this incident with John Adams very much so kind of showed, because he was both enchanted and horrified by it.
Right.
Horrified by it because,
how much power it has.
Yeah. And
How it can really captivate
and
the
enchanted,
imagination.
exactly. Enchanted because of the beauty. And so I think that Dr. Jones is missing a lot of this. But, so in many ways, I've always felt that what I have been told by people is that Logos Rising is not a good book. I have been told that Libido Dominandi is a lot of tangential conspiracy web spinning. Okay? And conspiracy, it should not be a derogatory word, but I mean that in its derogatory sense. You know what I mean? I've been told all of these things. I have told that even the JRS, just go look at the Fidelity Press catalog to see what book I'm referencing. But I've been told even JRS has some bad gaps in it. E. Michael Jones is not a historian. He should not be treated as a historian. He needs to stop doing history. What he's very good at is cultural criticism. And I've always felt that EMJ's very wide encompassing cultural criticism, and some of the observations of the traditionalist movement have always kind of needed a bit of a synthesis.
Yeah.
So, for example, you know, if you had a pope that just suddenly gave the Latin Mass in like a bull invoking, you know, an infallible formula, right? Gave the Latin Mass equal footing to the Novus Ordo, and even later abolished the Novus Ordo. That would help a lot, but it would not be a silver bullet to solving any of this. I mean, a base pope period would help a lot, but even then, that wouldn't solve any of this thoroughly. And the reason is because you're still living in a suburb. Great, you can say the Latin Mass. You're still living in a suburb. You know, we don't have to rehash, you know, E. Michael Jones's, you know, kind of his shortcomings when it comes to how biology and genetics on race and all that. But,
and also, though, like, the church doesn't, even if that happened, the church wouldn't magically be given the capacity to be a strong voice of authority for the world today.
Mm-hmm. The Latin Mass minus organic community isn't going to be the force that it was in the time of Father Coughlin and Fulton Sheen and Fulton Sheen in black and white. Okay,
and certainly not the Latin Mass as disconnected from the ordinary organs of the church. Yep. Right. I think that's another important point, which is that the solution can never be, if you want to help with the crisis in the church today, the solution can never be isolation from the main visible structure of the church as it exists today. That's how you make the situation permanent, actually.
Well, and the thing of it is what's really what EMJ rightly sees is that you have, frankly, boutique consumerists like Rod Dreher essentially advocating a total retreat from the culture war.
Right.
And like I said, I'm still reading through Del Noce, still trying to completely digest him. I think he's a little bit unfair to Carl Schmitt, but that's neither here nor there right now. But, you know, I bring up Del Noce because it's like everything has been leveled. Everything has been leveled. But at the same time, while that's true, you can't just retreat. And so people like, you know, Franco and Salazar and Father Coughlin, I don't endorse everything Julius Evola says, but, you know, he has that quote about the centurion at Pompeii, right?
Yeah.
Which is that, you know, that your job is to stand at the gate and die with your boots on for the glory of Catholica in the truest sense.
Right.
And if you don't do that, then, and it's like, well, are we supposed to all die? Are we all supposed to? No. You're supposed to set up a parallel society within the world. And so what EMJ correctly sees is that, you know, he doesn't say that Summorum introduced this situation. He's saying this situation was already existing.
Right.
And which was, and he talks about this in his, it's a shame because EMJ's best stuff is his articles, and it's kept, and it's not sold anymore on the damn Culture Wars website, and he really should. But, you know, in Benedict's Rule, where he draws a parallel to, you know, the Roman Empire in decline and the Visigothic and the Ostrogothic kingdom of Rome and our own times. He discusses about how basically Saint Benedict and the Benedictines were part of the process of civilizing the heathen barbarian, of casting out Arianism, and of bringing a new renewal to culture and allowing the church, both with, you know, barbarian prince with sword in hand and Benedictine abbot with crozier, to sanctify Europe.
Yeah.
But in America, you don't have ethnicity. You have politics. Right. You have politics. And this is where EMJ's take on race kind of is counterproductive to him. But just read CT's article on Bonaventure Hinwood to kind of balance that out. But in America, you have politics, and so it's no longer, oh, I'm Irish, I'm German, I'm Italian, I'm French, I'm Russian, I'm this, I'm that. I have a sense of community that is rooted to place, culture, language, history, genetics. I have a past, and therefore I have a future. Instead of that, you have politics. I'm a liberal Catholic. I'm a conservative Catholic. I'm a traditionalist Catholic. I'm into Medjugorje. Well, I'm into the Latin Mass. Well, I'm into Akita. I am into the charismatic movement. He's critical of the charismatic movement, too, for introducing yet another, you know, boutique thing. And these criticisms are not they're good criticisms, and they're very much so worth thinking about. And even at one time, I'm not going to say who this was, but a certain big, you know, traditionalist account on Twitter kind of opened up to me, and he said to me, you know, you're right about that, about the Latin Mass not being a silver bullet. And saying, you know, that we, you know, I looked around and I realized, you know, we don't have a community, and we don't have basically cultural and ethnic cohesion here. And so you shouldn't dismiss EMJ's critique of that. But
because unfortunately, a lot of people do look toward very artificial solutions. I was on Twitter today, and I saw another big traditionalist account say that, because Vatican II's liberal dispositions, that somehow means that the post-Vatican II popes, even though they're real popes, they can't exercise their magisterium.
But
so therefore we don't have to listen to anything they say ever, and we can be perfectly safe in this little isolated bubble of what does EMJ say? He says of the traditional Latin Mass and all of its counter-reformational splendor. He uses that phrase kind of maybe even derisively, but no, I mean, that's kind of the mentality that some people have in response, and it's a very artificial solution, and it fundamentally just it doesn't work. Not just theologically, but even for the sort of the cultural and pragmatic reasons that you're getting into.
As a good friend of the show, Tim, has said, and I am shamelessly stealing his talking points from private conversations. Humane Vitae from Paul VI and John Paul II's Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, they're clearly authoritative.
Yeah.
And, Humane Vitae is about birth control.
And also, by the way, Evangelium Vitae of John Paul II, he goes on 3 times. It's 2 times to condemn abortion and euthanasia in a way that explicitly invokes his infallibility.
He invokes the Petrine ministry.
Yeah, he does. He says that he explicitly gives like a formula for establishing this as the ordinary and universal magisterium, so that this is the constant teaching of the church, and that all the bishops of the world, in communion with me, by virtue of my apostolic authority, proposed this as to be definitively held.
No, that's hardcore.
And he says that for condemning abortion, and not only abortion but also political cooperation with abortion, and euthanasia. So John Paul II actually, you know, I would argue John Paul II acted more as he invoked his papal authority much more than Benedict did. You know, Benedict never issued one definitive statement
It's a
through his entire
shame.
pontificate. Not at least not one that was definitive in and of itself.
All of those freaking Palpatine Pope memes, and he was just like a kindly old man who liked
Yeah, all of
liturgy and
his
cats.
encyclicals were much, yeah, exactly, were more ruminative. They were more scholarly, theological. John Paul II laid down the hammer a few times.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and so I think that so yeah. So the other things that so Jeffrey Tucker and the Acton Institute and what's his name? He wrote the book with Christopher Ferrara, The Great Facade, and then they had a falling out because he's a libertarian. Tom Woods.
Tom Woods, yeah, Thomas Woods.
Yeah. He wrote a very good Catholic history introduction to the church, by the way.
Yes.
But
Although, are you talking about how the church built?
yeah, it's
I have some problems with that book, but
it's very very entry core.
yeah,
But
I think some of my main criticisms are like, hey, did you know that the scholastics of Salamanca gave birth to like libertarian economics? Isn't that so wonderful? It's like, not really.
right, yeah, there's kind of an annoying tendency for Catholics, even since the 19th century, to be like, look at all of the things the Catholic Church did to establish the modern world.
Well, yeah, look at how great Roger Bacon was for prioritizing like uh, empirical experimental science epistemically before metaphysics. Isn't that great? No, it's not.
Right. It's like the way that the secularists goes is they're like, thanks a lot, idiot. Now go die. Thanks a lot. There's a really good book called it's a decent book called 13th Greatest of Centuries by a man named Dr.
I do like that book.
Dr. James J. Walsh. He did a lot of stuff. You can find all of his stuff on Archive, and I believe on Gutenberg. And he is someone who basically points out how much of a debt we owe the Catholic Church without going too much into the whole, like, isn't it great that we have the COVID vaccine because the Church invented hospitals? He doesn't, Dr. Walsh doesn't do goofy stuff like that.
Oh, brother.
Yeah. But anyway, I digress. So there is some truth to that about how, Latin Mass, not a silver bullet, and that there are some groups in America that do not, talk about the things they should about like a certain ethnic group, and just focus on the Latin Mass. I have been told that this is a purely American phenomenon. I've been told that. It is a purely Anglophone phenomenon. It's in the United Kingdom and in America. So perhaps that's true.
I think Latin Mass groups are also the most... they tend to be the most politically and ideologically motivated in America, so that also might be why.
Yeah. Most people that I've met two people. I know two people who are kind of prominent people on the dissident right that both go to their local SSPX chapel, or even not so local. One of them drives a couple hours. That they talk about how they'll go to the donut hour and everyone's like talking about the latest episode of The Daily Wire with Ben Shapiro. And this isn't to humiliate. No, don't misunderstand me. I'm just saying that this happens. That just because and the thing of it is though, this is an incongruous situation where it's like, okay, how can you listen to Ben Shapiro and go to the Latin Mass? That doesn't actually work, and it's because these people aren't thinking about it that critically.
Well, take even Taylor Marshall, right? Taylor Marshall is probably one of the biggest, most mainstream proponents of like the SSPX side of this issue. And he is kind of a normie conservative politically.
Yeah.
He doesn't touch this question that E. Michael Jones wants us to touch. He doesn't really get into any kind of purely political um, issue that one could describe as particularly reactionary or dissident.
Yeah. And that's a problem. But um I think that, yeah, and I think it's a shame because I guess we can talk a little bit about this. It's a shame that EMJ's. Is it though? So I feel bad for EMJ because I feel like a lot of people took what he said at face value and really didn't listen to him.
Well, let me say this first. People attacked EMJ because they don't understand that this was always EMJ's position.
Yes.
Like, a lot of people were shocked that he would take this position. I assumed he would.
Mm-hmm. And
and it is unfortunate. I mean, like, we don't agree with it largely.
The one thing that is interesting that he did bring is about George Soros donating millions of dollars to the American Jesuits.
Yes.
And that the Jesuits, or the Jesuit order, period, not the American Jesuits, but that the Jesuits in particular are the vehicle of...
He gave a very interesting hermeneutic about that, actually, because he said that the Jesuits, they sort of started off as like the special ops for the Pope.
Yeah, they're an army.
Which is true. And that part of the reason why they're in the state that they're in was because of how many they wanted to influence things, like in the United States, but they had to make so many concessions, and they had to they had to concede so much because of right, because of the kind of people that EMJ is concerned about, and gradually this snowballs into a point in time where the Jesuits kind of internalize this so much so that they become in themselves liberalized and heretical and heterodox and un-Catholic.
Yeah, I mean, an example of
and this culminates, ironically and funnily enough, in America magazine, right?
Yeah.
they internalize this Americanist, to use Leo XIII's term, these Americanist errors so much so that it culminates in America magazine that we see today. Anyway, go on.
And a good example of just how flagrantly active the Jesuits was you can just look into Daniel Berrigan, Commonweal and American Magazine talk, and his priest, who was not a Jesuit, but his brother, the Berrigan brothers, Daniel Berrigan and his brother Philip Berrigan, they were both priests, and they got their start in anti-Vietnam War activism, anti-nuclear stuff, and they did some mild domestic terrorist activities. So the Jesuits just, I mean, and this is what EMJ says, they are a third column in the church. And you know, that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
Just Berrigan's wiki page, here are the headings: activism, Vietnam War era, plowshare movement, consistent life ethic, AIDS activism.
And this is kind of the problem, because if EMJ would spend a lot of his time on this issue, I think it would be extremely helpful to the conversation. B, if his new detractors would have the sense to disentangle the good from the bad in what he says, they might pick up some insights even as they push back against his excesses.
Yeah, exactly. It really does it's a shame. It's really a shame. And the thing of it is too is his. I think EMJ's sun is setting in terms of his the moment that he enjoyed thanks to the internet of kind of giving him a reemergence in his work. Maybe
Yeah.
we can talk about that a little bit as a closing.
Yeah, I do think that because he attracted so much attention from young reactionary traditionalists that really have a very strong attachment and devotion to specifically the Latin Mass and Catholic traditionalism in particular, which which he in many ways fostered, because he didn't discuss this recently.
No,
He didn't discuss his anti-SSPI. He was silent on that
no, he
for
didn't.
for a while, and I think this caught a lot of people by surprise, and I think a lot of people are just not going to listen to him anymore. A lot of his core constituents are just going to look elsewhere, um, precisely because of his stance on the Latin Mass, which we all knew he had, but unfortunately, a lot of his new fans didn't.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as we said, I think this view on the old mass is purely from a unfortunately tunnel visioned obsession. Not obsession, because it's a good preoccupation to have, but just he focused so much on Catholic unity that
Yeah.
I think he thinks that like the church could be just as effective with like a reverent Novus Ordo if that was the norm, and it's like I don't think so.
Yeah, and people know my position on this. I think Novus Ordo is legitimate. It's licit. And I think we should. By the way, we should advocate for. I think referral reform. I think that would help things. Like I don't think it would be a waste of time. Like if the church is going to be, uh, if the church is going to be insistent on maintaining this, we should try to make it as faithful to the rubrics as possible and as faithful to Sacrosanctum Concilium as possible. And I think that would help things.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't think that can be ignored or disregarded as illegitimate just because of our uh, stronger and justified attachment to the old rite. But it won't be sufficient.
Yeah. I'm glad that you can admit that. I almost feel like that's new ground that we've covered there. I'm slowly radicalizing him, folks. Um, I'm kidding. But yeah, I did you so. I keep saying maybe we'll have him on. I think I might make an attempt to talk to him about some of this. I mean, he needs to, like I said, like some of his best stuff, like Benedict's Rule, Requiem for a Whale Rider, Sex with Monsters, all kinds of just really good, ebooks and articles. I mean, you can go to the Culture Wars archive, but they're just not as accessible as when he was selling those ebooks on Amazon. Which of course they're all gone. But really, though, that's him at his best, is when he's doing cultural criticism, when he's basically being like Theodore Dalrymple, not when he's trying to be like big tome massive tome historian and metaphysician and intellectual genealogist. No, I think Augusto Del Noce is better at that.
Yeah.
But the thing of it is as our friend Serp Kerp, because we were talking about this the other day, right? He was saying that EMJ is just one item in your toolkit in terms of intellectual growth and understanding what's going on. There are better places you can go. I think I will put Gonzo's review of Richard Greenhorn's of the American Sun, a frequent contributor to the American Sun. I'll put his review of Libido Dominandi into the description. I think it's more harsh than it needs to be. I think Libido, but I haven't read it. But yeah, EMJ has his place in your toolkit, and completely dismissing him knee-jerk is not good. Rewatch his video, rewatch the interview with Peter Helland, and really listen and consider what he's saying, because there is merit to it, although there is this decades-long flaw that he's had, because all he sees in the traditionalist movement is disunity, and it's just like, nope, they've got a point. They've got a point, and you've got a point. This isn't big brain centrism. It's just that you're very wrong about certain things, Dr. Jones. But
well, and he's aware of the need for synthesis and the whole cunning of reason business. He talks about this all the time.
Yeah. In his when he does German idealism. But yeah, I mean, I guess any last words then before we wrap this up? I almost feel like we're having a wake for E. Michael Jones's like influence, frankly.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think, I guess what I would just say in closing is precisely what you said, which is I think he's an important resource for a narrowly specific set of topics, and he should be. What he says on this should not be ignored. It should be considered and integrated within, I think, an understanding that is a bit better couched in the church's theology of liturgy and ecclesiology and things like that. But I hope our discussion has at least helped to encourage listeners to look at his video again through a different set of eyes. Understand that we disagree with a lot of it, so we're not saying to necessarily change your view on what he said, but maybe be just a little bit more open to some of his critiques, even if you have to separate a lot of wheat from chaff.
Yeah, and I will let EMJ's cracked singing of the neocon song take us out today.
Oh boy, why?
You don't like it?
I think it's kind of cringe.
Okay, well,
but go ahead.
Either way, all right. And if Dr. Jones ever wants to talk, we would be more than willing to. Even if he wants to roast us about our, schismatic mentality or whatever. I doubt he will. But all right, bye everybody.
My name is Irving Crystal, and my son, his name is Bill. In my youth I followed Trotsky, and in truth I follow him still. But to